Perhaps one of the most chilling predators of the African bush is the hyena. Portrayed as a dim-witted scavenger, these animals are actually highly intelligent and skilled hunters. They can bring down large prey, much larger than themselves, such as buffalo, and can work together in groups called clans. They have a bad reputation and are most famed for scavenging, relying on others to do the hard work, whilst feasting on the leftovers, crunching on the bones. They are generally considered nocturnal hunters, but are also active during the day. Stories of them snatching people from their beds as they sleep peacefully at night, or taking babies from around campfires, are terrifying realities of living in or visiting rural Africa. The power of their bite is one of the most powerful in the animal kingdom. In comparison to an average human's bite of 162 psi, the hyena is estimated to be as much as 1100 psi. They have been recorded killing dogs with a single bite to the neck. Once they lock on to their prey, there is no letting go. Their bite is even stronger than some of the big cat species. The story of 5-year-old Abel is one of the worst hyena attacks of all time and is truly incredible. He suffered the most horrendous injuries imaginable and, miraculously, lived to tell the tale. Surgeons were shocked when Abel was rushed into hospital. He was hardly recognizable. From the ferocious and brutal hyena attack, his lower jaw had been ripped clean off. His upper lip and right ear had been torn away. He struggled to breathe. His life was hanging on the line. On June 18, 2015, Kefiolek was inside her home whilst her 5-year-old son, Abel, played outside. She and her family lived in the rural village of Debina in Ethiopia's Kanso highlands. The little village was surrounded by countryside, an agricultural landscape interspersed with trees and shrubs. It is a place where cultural traditions remain strong, where there is a tight-knit community and a peaceful way of life. Abel was a happy little boy. He was always playing with his friends, shrieking in delight as they chased each other and played games. But on this particular day, his shrieks turned to screams, ear-piercing screams that made Kefiolek stop what she was doing and rush outside. At first, she thought that Abel was just playing around. Then, she thought he may have fallen and hurt himself. Perhaps the other children were being too rough and there had been a scuffle. All these thoughts raced around her head when she first heard the scream, but it was none of these reasons that had caused the young boy to scream. Instead, what she saw will haunt her for the rest of her days. At first, she didn't see Abel. He had been playing just feet from the house, but now he had vanished. When she looked around, she saw drag marks in the dusty red earth. She ran along the trail, following the drag marks, following the screams. Then she saw him, her 5-year-old boy, in the jaws of a ferocious hyena. The animal had appeared from nowhere. It had smelt the children playing and had run at the youngsters, grabbing Abel around the head. The other children had fled the scene in terror as soon as the hyena grabbed Abel. It had dragged the boy for 400 yards through the rough ground and through the undergrowth. There, at the end of the trail, was Abel lying on the ground, a hyena biting on the young boy's head. Kefiolek screamed in terror when she saw them. Immediately she ran at the hyena, yelling and shouting. She didn't fear for her own safety. She didn't hesitate. She did what any mother would do and ran to protect her child. Abel's screams had now stopped. He had no fight left to give. The hyena ripped off the boy's jaw and lifted its head, its jowls dripping with blood. Kefiolek raced up to it as it resumed biting Abel on his head and face. She jumped onto the hyena, pulling and tugging at the hunched creature until it let go of the boy and skulked off into the surrounding undergrowth. The hyena was gone, but the damage had already been done. Kefiolek rushed to her son's side. He lay still, his tiny body limp on the dry, dusty ground. He was hardly recognizable. Amongst the pouring blood, his face was mangled and disfigured. His face had been ripped in half. The hyena had torn his lower jaw from his head. His mouth was now gaping open with half of his tongue missing. An ear had been severed from the side of his head. His eyes were closed. It must have been the most distressing sight for his mother. When Kefiolek picked up her boy, tears streaming down her face, she felt Abel's chest rise and fall. He was still breathing. He was unconscious, but he was still alive. She raced to find help and rushed him to the local medical post. There was nothing they could do for him. His injuries were too severe. They didn't have the equipment or the trained staff to save Abel's life, so his mother rushed him to the local hospital, farther away. Running through the doors with her son dying in her arms, she was desperate, but they only had bad news for her. They too said there was no hope for the boy's survival there. They simply didn't have the staff or equipment to deal with the situation. He needed to be taken for specialist treatment in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. But that was a grueling 7-hour car ride away using Ethiopia's rural roads. Kefyalik had to try. She couldn't sit back and do nothing. She knew Abel would die if she stayed where she was. She jumped in a vehicle and headed northwards. With every bump in the road and every corner they rounded, Kefyalik prayed little Abel would make it. But it was going to be a long shot. Would the little boy's heart hold out? Could he survive such an ordeal? As the hours ticked by, it seemed less and less likely. After the agonizing journey, they finally made it to St. Paul's Hospital. When he arrived, Abel was in a critical state. He was rushed to intensive care, where he was resuscitated and intubated. When he was stable enough, he was taken to surgery. Because his lower jaw and muscles had been torn away, there was a danger that his windpipe could collapse. Doctors inserted a small metal frame to hold his windpipe open to help him breathe. During the surgery, his father, Mesfrin, who was at work at the time his son was attacked, arrived at the hospital shortly after hearing the bad news. Looking at his son through the glass window, he knew there was no hope for him. The injuries were shocking. They were unsurvivable. At least that's what Mesfrin thought. Doctors told Abel's parents that he had less than a 10% chance of making it. But his parents were fighters just as much as their son, and Mesfrin spotted a poster on the hospital corridor's wall. It was an advert for Facing Africa, a charity that offered facial reconstruction surgery to people in Ethiopia. It was the hope that Abel needed. With such serious injuries, Abel couldn't eat, drink, or speak. He had to be fed through a nasal tube. Staff from Facing Africa agreed to meet Abel and his parents and discuss their options. They took photos of the boy's injuries and sent them to the UK, where the charity's head office is located. From there, the decision to reconstruct Abel's face was made. A team of volunteer surgeons was brought together, and Abel underwent 9 hours of surgery to help rebuild his face and jaw. They used bone and skin from his leg to reconstruct his lower jaw, the first operation of its kind in Africa. For now, Abel can talk, eat, and drink unaided. Just days after the surgery, he was able to begin moving his new lower jaw. 4 months later, he was back playing with his friends, showing glimmers of the happy, playful little boy that he once was. As he grows, he will need further surgery, but for now, he has more or less the same ability he had before the attack. None of this would have been possible without charitable donations to Facing Africa's charity. It is incredible what surgeons can do to save someone's life. It is even more incredible what the human body can endure. Abel had survived a hyena attack that would have brought most adults to their terrifying final affliction. Mike Hodge and his wife Chrissy moved to South Africa 30 years ago, all to pursue Mike's passion for the magnificent African wildlife. Mike specialized in the most fearsome of them all, the mighty African lion. In less than 10 years, Mike and Chrissy overhauled their little oasis in the bush into a sanctuary where injured lions, abandoned cubs, and a fair number of other wildlife found their permanent home. Miraculous Animal Sanctuary wasn't just known for its game drives and regular old African safari-style entertainment. Mike and Chrissy had lions, cheetahs, and leopards right in the heart of the property. Some of the animals brought in were so injured when they were found that they'd never survive on their own in the wild. But thanks to Mike and Chrissy, they were held in massive enclosures so that they could live long and healthy lives as close to their original environments as possible. Mike was never in the business of raising circus animals who'd do backflips for a treat. He understood the nature of a wild animal better than anyone. Even the cubs that they raised by hand were never left alone with other humans. And whenever Mike or his staff entered an enclosure, even as friendly as the lions were, someone always had a loaded hunting rifle at the ready, just in case. And for the more sensitive of our viewers, this rather extreme precaution amongst seemingly tame kittens was what ultimately saved Mike's life. His playful cats that he'd fed in the night and raised on his lap were never underestimated, and guests were allowed to view them but never feed or interact personally with the predators, just like it would have been in the wild. The only real difference here was that the cats were supplied food by the staff, and with the high fence line, visitors could view them closer than they would have on a game drive out in the wild. Shamba, the biggest of Mike's captive lions, was the main attraction for everyone. He was found as the lone surviving cub of his litter, his mother probably killed by another predator. Between Mike and Chrissy, they fed Shamba bottles by hand and allowed him to sleep on their laps so that he wouldn't mewl and cry in the night for his lost siblings and mother. Mike liked to entertain visitors by going into Shamba's enclosure and feeding him by hand, and showing them how the mighty beast loved a scratch behind the ears. This was exactly the case on May 2nd, 2018. Mike and his wife were now in their early 70s, and at a time when most people would have long since retired, they were still going strong and accepting more guests than ever. Chrissy had received a group of 3 married couples, all in their late 30s, from America the night before. The group were planning on spending the next 2 days exploring the reserve and shaking off their jet lag. After a good night's sleep, Mike and his best tour guide, Lubanzi, took the group out bright and early. Lubanzi noticed that Shamba was not his usual self, and the guide, an expert in his field, thought he knew what it was. Inside Shamba's enclosure there was the unmistakable musk left behind by a badger. Apparently the ferocious little beast had gotten into the lion's space the night before and left its scent everywhere that it could reach. Lubanzi used Shamba's breakfast to keep the lion's attention occupied elsewhere so that he could try to find the badger, but apparently the animal had gone off to find someone else to terrorize. He reported his suspicions to Mike, but besides Shamba being a little on edge, there wasn't much else they could do until they caught and relocated the badger. They drove the armored jeep, spotting out the various bucks, elephants, and even a herd of zebras. The morning was everything that an African safari promised to be on the brochures. After a quick lunch under the canopy of the trees, the group was taken to the fenced-in enclosures where the permanent rescues stayed, starting with a pair of springbuck babies that were being fed milk from handheld bottles. They worked their way up to the more exotic creatures, including 2 cheetahs and a mean-tempered serval cat who wasn't willing to come out to greet them. They ended the ride with a visit to Shamba's enclosure, where Mike got out and confidently entered through the high gates. Lubanzi followed, his rifle slung over his shoulder, as was protocol. The couples had been eagerly awaiting this part of the trip all day. Shamba's reputation was legendary, and Mike's handling of him was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Unlike every other visit, Shamba did not bound over to Mike with excitement. Instead, he had his nose on the ground, still sniffing at the musk that last night's intruder had left behind. When Mike walked up to him, Shamba didn't see his old friend. He was in the throes of being territorial. He was defensive and already poised for a fight. Shamba just leapt at him, and Mike recognized immediately that the growls and the sudden spring was uncharacteristic. He bolted for the gate as fast as his geriatric legs could carry him. Had he been a few years younger, he'd have made it the short distance to the gate, but he was not a young man anymore. Shamba outstripped him almost instantly, ramming full force into Mike just as he reached out for the gate. The Americans started screaming in panic and fear. Lubanzi, on the other hand, had his rifle out and at the ready before Mike even reached the gate. He didn't dare fire at Shamba just yet, for fear of hitting Mike. Shamba hooked the elderly man with his claws, pulled Mike away from the gate that he was hanging onto for dear life, and dragged him across the ground. Mike went limp, not because fear had incapacitated him, but because he knew better than to put up a fight. If he reacted now, Shamba would retaliate to any sudden movement with murderous finality. So despite the burning pain in his jaw and the searing wounds on his back, Mike allowed himself to be dragged like a ragdoll a few feet away, not even daring to yell out in pain. If he could scream, it would have been to tell the tourists to keep quiet. Their terrified yells and one of the women's hysterical crying were surely driving Shamba to even greater fury. The explosion of noise was just adding to the chaos. Lubanzi fired a round into the air, and Shamba was shaken out of his moment of madness for just long enough to let go of Mike. And still, Mike didn't move. But neither did Shamba. He stood over Mike like a predator guarding a kill, ready to square off with whoever fired the round. Lubanzi didn't need to take a second to decide. With Mike on the ground and finally out of Shamba's jaws, this was going to be the only chance Lubanzi had to save his boss's life. A second of hesitation was all that Shamba needed to finish Mike off, so Lubanzi fired the second round, hitting Shamba squarely in the chest. The lion bounded back from Mike, running around in a half circle, thoroughly confused at the sting in his chest, not realizing that he was mortally wounded. But the damage was done. The lion, now mad with pain, added to its already uncontrollable territorial instinct. It was a time bomb waiting to happen. Lubanzi took a moment to see if Mike was even still alive, but Mike was lying still as death. He turned back and fired 2 more shots. Shamba stumbled a few feet backwards, reeling from the blast, and fell dead on the ground. With the screams and yells still ringing in his ears, Lubanzi stepped into the enclosure, his rifle still raised in case Shamba wasn't as dead as he seemed, while another guide ran in after him and dragged Mike out by his armpits. Miraculously, Mike was conscious, and he even directed his staff on calling emergency services and on how to evacuate the traumatized tourists. To them, Mike looked like he was at death's door. The man was bleeding profusely from the grooves left by Shamba's claws in his back, and his jaw was very clearly broken. It was a wonder that Mike could even manage to talk. He was airlifted to Johannesburg within the hour, while Chrissy drove the couples to a local hotel. The visitors wanted nothing more than to get away from the sanctuary after their ordeal. Mike, accompanied by Lubanzi and his stepdaughter, waited all day to see him out of surgery. Mike, like he always had, just powered through it all. Besides his jaw being broken in 2 places from being rammed into the metallic gate, he had a dozen scratches that required more than 100 stitches. You'd think that Mike would call it a day and finally retire, but no. The Hodge family are still there, rescuing and raising the very predators that nearly took Mike's life. If anything, the sanctuary, the Hodges, and the staff mourned the loss of Shamba. They'd seen him grow up before their eyes, and they knew better than anyone that a wild animal will always be just that, wild. No one blamed Shamba, but Lubanzi did blame himself. He's never quite gotten over killing the king of the jungle. As thankful as he was that Mike could live to save another animal, he can't stop replaying the memory of Shamba's terrifying final affliction. It was January 2007, and professional abalone fisherman Eric Nerhus headed out into the choppy waters off Australia's southeastern coastline. Driving the boat was his 25-year-old son, Mark. The steady sea breeze whipped the surface of the ocean up. Wavelets splashed the sides of the boat, and salt spray filled the air. Many abalone divers stayed on dry land that morning, waiting for conditions to improve. But Eric had a quota to reach, and he was eager to dive in. They headed out of Twofold Bay at Eden to a dive site Eric was familiar with. He had dived there hundreds of times before. He knew the area, and he knew the layout of the seafloor. It was familiar territory, but this time was different. In the preceding weeks, nearby beaches had been closed, as great white sharks had been spotted during routine aerial patrols. They were drawn closer to the coastline by unseasonably cold water. Eric had thought about sharks before. It was often the last thought that went through his head each time he entered the water to fish. But the likelihood of being attacked by one were statistically very low. When they anchored up, there were a few other boats in the area, also searching for abalone. Eric and the other divers pulled on their wetsuits. Eric wore a full-length black wetsuit with a hood, green gloves, mask, fins, and a lead-weighted vest. Lead weight was required by divers to sink below the surface. Typical scuba divers wear a weighted belt, but for abalone fishermen who can spend up to 6 hours a day in the water, this can be a strain on the back. Instead, they prefer to wear a lead vest. Eric carried with him an abalone iron to pry the sea snails off the rocks, and a mesh bag to collect them in. When Mark anchored up, they were in 25 feet of water. The abalone were fixed to the coral reef below them, near the seafloor. A hookah rig allowed Eric to breathe underwater without the cumbersome scuba tanks. The long air lines were secured on board the boat. Mark watched as his father submerged below the choppy surface. Under the water, the visibility was incredibly poor, but Eric dived down. He located the abalone. There was a line of them along the seabed. Eric studied each one briefly before scraping it off the reef and securing it in his bag. He was only allowed to collect abalone that had reached a certain size. It was a sustainable form of fishing with rules and regulations to keep the stock populated. The sound of his iron scraping over the rocks and coral alerted the attention of something lurking near the reef. It moved closer, sensing the vibrations. With his head down, scouring the floor, Eric didn't notice an enormous predator approach him. Instead, he was suddenly snatched by something and plunged into darkness. At first, he couldn't comprehend what had happened to him, but then he felt the crushing sensation of something clamping around his head. He could feel the sharp teeth of a shark bite down around his flesh. That's when he realized that it must be a shark, and the panic set in. The initial knock had startled and disoriented him. Now he couldn't see anything because he was inside the shark's mouth, staring down its throat. His shoulders and right arm were secured firmly inside the shark. He only had his left arm free to try and grapple with it. The force from the hit knocked Eric's regulator out of his mouth. He was holding his breath, desperately clinging on to life as the shark tried to swallow him whole. He could feel the jaws continually chomping down, trying to take a bite from its prey. The pressure was too much, and Eric's nose, which was forced against his dive mask, gave in and broke. When the shark had secured its grip, it took Eric from side to side, thrashing him through the water. Inside Eric's head, he knew this was the end. He believed the shark was trying to rip off its chunk of meat, and that chunk may well be his head. But he had been wrong in his presumption on the shark's behavior. The shark could have easily severed Eric in two, even with his lead vest on. It could have taken a chunk out of him if it wanted to. It is more likely that, in the murky water, it was sizing up its prey. It was trying to make sense of the animal near the seafloor to see if it submitted and became easy to consume. It was being cautious instead of attacking him full throttle, as is often the case with great white sharks. Whilst inside the shark's mouth, engulfed by darkness and secured by razor-sharp teeth, Eric felt along the outside of the shark's head with his only free hand. He ran his gloved fingers along the side of the shark until he came to its eye. When he was sure he was touching the shark's eye socket, he poked it as hard as he could. It was the only thing he could do. It was the only way he could fight back. The shark immediately loosened its grip around the 41-year-old's torso. When he felt the pressure release slightly, he wriggled backwards, pushing himself out. As he did so, his mask came off and fell into the shark's mouth. Even without the mask, he could see the shark hadn't left him. It eyed him close by, but Eric had to keep his cool. The first thing he did, when he was free, was to grab his regulator and put it back into his mouth. He took a long, deep breath. It was a huge relief to breathe in the oxygen again. Doing so allowed him to calm down and assess the situation. He had estimated that he had been inside the shark's mouth for 2 minutes, as it had tried to swallow him. But in reality, he was unlikely to have been able to hold his breath that long when the adrenaline was pumping throughout his body and he was fighting with every fiber in his body to push the shark off him. It was likely a much shorter time than that, but even so, it was a terrifying ordeal, and now he had to fight the urge to race to the surface for help. He was still 25 feet under the water and risked decompression sickness if he ascended too quickly. But the shark that had just tried to eat him was circling him. He could see it as it slowly glided around and around him in tight circles. Even without his mask, he could make out the shark's toothy grin and its dark eyes. It was still interested in him and could finish him off at any moment. Sometimes sharks will deliver a powerful bite and then swim a short distance away, waiting for the prey to bleed out. With the likes of sea lions, this reduces the risk of the shark being bitten during the attack. Only when the animal is in a weakened state would it come in for its final blow. Perhaps this shark was waiting for signs of weakness from Eric. It was biding its time before coming in for the kill. But Eric had been fortunate. The lead-weighted vest he wore had mostly protected him from the devastating damage the shark's bite could have inflicted. Later, upon inspection, the vest was punctured with 14 tooth marks. Each one of those could have been into his flesh had he been wearing a conventional weight belt instead. He and his friend Dennis had always thought that the tough vests might prove effective against a shark bite one day. Now, it had proven its worth. It was concerning that Eric was bleeding significantly, just feet from the shark. He held his bag of abalone out between him and the shark as he made his way slowly upwards. He knew the most dangerous time for a diver was when he or she was at the surface. Sharks often made a surprise attack from below, emerging from the depths and powering into their prey with such force that it can send the animal flying through the air, causing catastrophic damage. The trail of blood was coming from his broken nose, deep wounds to his right shoulder, and slashes across his chest. When he surfaced, he spat his regulator out and cried out to his son in the boat. Mark immediately came to his rescue and pulled him out of the water. As he did so, the shark swam directly underneath Eric's legs, perhaps a last-second attempt to take another bite. The water was a cloud of red. 2 other divers on board a nearby boat rushed over. One of them radioed his father, who was in a spotter plane overhead, and asked him to call for emergency help. They jumped aboard the boat and administered first aid to Eric. The key was trying to keep him as calm as possible, whilst also stemming the bleeding. The boat was splashed in red. Blood trickled onto the floor, swirling around with the motion of the sea. When they made it to shore just after 11 a.m., a snowy hydro-rescue helicopter arrived 15 minutes later. It was decided to fly Eric to Wollongong Hospital rather than nearby Canberra so that they could fly at a lower altitude and avoid the risks of decompression sickness. Flying at altitude after diving can cause serious problems. On board the chopper, Eric remained conscious, but he was suffering from shock and significant blood loss. He was rushed through to emergency at the hospital, where he was admitted in a serious but stable condition. The cuts and gashes across his head, face, and body were cleaned and sewn up using 75 stitches. Eric had been incredibly lucky to survive the attack. There is no doubt that his vest saved him from most of the damage, but it was also the shark's behavior that had prevented him from being devoured in a matter of seconds. Whilst Eric believes that his attack was a case of mistaken identity, sharks are not known to attack sea lions near the seafloor where Eric was that day. The shark was checking him out and trying to determine whether he would make for a good meal or not. Luckily, Eric didn't stick around in the water long enough to find out, narrowly escaping his terrifying final affliction. Rudy Nulander had a business renting out ATVs. Hunters would hire his vehicles and use them to track game over rough terrain and mountainous backcountry. His company, Alpine Adventures, was situated in Big Sky, Montana. Although hunting is not required in Big Sky itself, there are many surrounding national forests. A variety of wildlife can be found in the region, from elk and deer to black bears, grizzlies, and wolves. Nature trails and hiking routes are abundant, and campsites are dotted about for outdoor enthusiasts to enjoy. In September 2023, some of Rudy's clients returned to Alpine Adventures unsuccessful. They hadn't caught anything on their hunting trip, but they claimed to have shot a deer. Because it wasn't a clean shot, it had managed to escape them and evade capture. They had watched as it had trotted off into the trees. Rudy was an excellent outdoorsman. He knew how to track game, and so, being the good Samaritan that he was, offered to take one of his ATVs and track down the deer himself. He was happy to help out, and it was something he enjoyed anyway. The group of hunters led the way, driving into the wilderness and along the trail, where they had last caught a glimpse of the deer before it disappeared. Rudy followed them and climbed off his ATV when he could go no further. As Rudy peered through the trees, he saw a flash of brown. He trod carefully through the undergrowth, holding his firearm out in front of him. His heart began thumping in his chest. It was the thrill of the hunt. Just then he saw it again, but this time a bit more clearly. It wasn't a deer, it was a bear, a small brown bear that glanced up at him as it ambled through the woods. Rudy instinctively aimed his gun at it, but it trotted away, and he went back to searching for the lost deer. Half an hour later, there was another flash of brown. This time it was a much larger bear, almost 10 feet long. As he saw the brown fur behind the tree trunks, it charged at him, coming out of nowhere. There was no time for Rudy to pull out his bear spray from its holster. Instead, he raised his firearm, a revolver, and took aim. But when he squeezed the trigger, the gun misfired. The revolver wouldn't have likely stopped a charging bear anyway, but it was better than his bare hands. A split second later, and the bear was on top of him. It launched its attack, and he was sent crashing to the ground. He threw a punch as the bear lunged at him, but as his knuckles made contact with the bear's furry face, it made no impact whatsoever. The bear didn't flinch, and instead began biting Rudy repeatedly all over his body. He tried to push it off with his arms, but it bit down through them, tearing the skin, ripping the muscle. Its long, sharp, curved claws sliced across his chest, blood oozing from the open wounds. He could hear the breathing from the bear, the guttural grunting and snorting as it devoured him. He kept trying to fight it off, but it was a losing battle. He could feel himself growing weaker as the sheer weight of the grizzly pressed down on him, pinning him to the soft, wet ground. He needed to get over onto his stomach to protect his vital organs and his face, but the bear wouldn't let him roll over. Instead, he was face to face with the beast, and he could smell the stench of its breath. It smelled like rotting meat that had been left in the wild for weeks, rancid and fetid. Then he saw the bear bring its face closer to his. He tried to turn away as the muzzle was just centimeters from his own nose. The warmth and moisture from its breath landed on his cheeks, and he grimaced. Then the bear did the unspeakable. It bit onto Rudy's lower jaw. The force and the pressure from the bite were incredible, and Rudy felt as though his jaw was about to crack under the strain. But it was about to be far worse than that. The bear shook its head slightly and literally ripped Rudy's lower jaw clean off. He screamed in agony. The hunters who had been with rushed to his aid and fired their guns at the bear. It jumped backwards with each shot and ran away into the woodland, never to be seen again. The hunters raced to Rudy's aid, but he was in bad shape. They immediately called the emergency services, but it was difficult finding a safe place for the chopper to land. Rudy lay on the ground, fully conscious for a total of 2 hours before they heard the telltale whirring sound of the helicopter blades in the skies above them. It was a relief for the entire group when help finally arrived, but nobody knew Rudy's fate. He was airlifted out by Gallatin County Sheriff's search and rescue volunteers and transported by a life flight helicopter to Bozeman Deaconess Regional Medical Center. Once he was there, they would assess his wounds and begin to treat him. After an initial surgery to stabilize him, he was flown to University of Utah Hospital in a critical but stable condition, and his family were called. They rushed to his bedside, expecting the worst. It was a miracle that he was still alive, but he was in a terrible state, and it was touch and go whether he would make it. He was placed on a ventilator whilst surgeons tried to repair his jaw. In order to reconstruct it, doctors had to take some of his fibula bone in his leg, along with skin and an artery to help reattach his jaw to his neck. His lower lip was reconstructed from soft skin tissue from his head and neck. Then the whole of his jaw and head were strapped heavily to hold it in place. He was hardly recognizable in his hospital bed, but slowly, day by day, he grew stronger and was eventually taken off the ventilator. Nobody knew how significant the damage would be, or whether he would be able to speak or eat solid food ever again. He He had to be tested to check if he could swallow. His vocal cords had been damaged, and he was in a lot of pain. He communicated with his family and the medical team by writing messages on a whiteboard. His humor still shone through in the darkest of times when he described the bear attack as the most disgusting French kiss of his life. The whiteboard was his savior, as he was able to communicate his feelings to those around him. They adjusted his pain medication accordingly, and he, after several weeks in hospital, was allowed to go home. The area where the attack occurred was immediately sealed off, and hikers were turned away. Wildlife officials warned people that in September bears are still very much around and are still stocking up on fat reserves to survive the harsh winter months ahead. Those that have not quite gained the weight they should have by then can sometimes become aggressive or even make a predatory attack. However, experts believe that this was a defensive attack. The bear may have been defending a food source such as berries or even the carcass of the injured deer. The grizzly had seen Rudy as a threat and aimed to neutralize that threat by taking him down. But even as he lay on the ground completely defenseless against the grizzly giant, it didn't seem to let up its attack until gunshots were fired. Montana is prime bear country. It is also prime country to hike in and explore the great outdoors. The area Rudy and the hunters were in was in the Madison Range in the Rockies. It is situated in the westernmost part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But despite the hundreds of thousands of visitors to the state's wilderness areas, there are relatively few human bear encounters. In fact, in the past 50 years, there have been just 11 fatal bear attacks along the Continental Divide, which encompasses Glacier National Park. Rudy was incredibly unlucky to have been struck by the bear, but it wasn't the first time. This incident brought memories flooding back from an attack that had happened to him when he was much younger. He had encountered a bear at just 10 years old, which had broken his leg during a defensive attack, but his more recent one was much worse. To be attacked twice by a grizzly bear is a very rare thing, but luckily, Rudy lives to tell the story of the day he had his jaw bitten off by a grizzly bear, narrowly escaping his terrifying final affliction. Florida had a rough June in 2024. Well, more rough than usual anyway. The state is well known for being one of the most dangerous places as far as wildlife is concerned. Sharks, alligators, venomous snakes, black bears, panthers, and even the wild boars pose a significant threat. So it shouldn't be surprising that we get so many reports of deaths and attacks occurring from one of Mother Nature's favorite places to remind us of just how dangerous she can be. But June this year was an extreme month, even for Florida. In just 90 minutes, 3 back-to-back attacks from a single shark on a 4-mile stretch of beach in Walton County. It all started at 1 in the afternoon on June 5th, when Elizabeth Foley and her husband Ron were standing waist-deep in the water a few yards into the surf. Their children were seated on their towels, all tuckered out from a whole morning of swimming in the shallows. So when the couple finally had a moment to stretch out their arms, they took the opportunity. For a 45-year-old mother of 3, Elizabeth was very fit and active, and so was Ron. They made the swim out to the sandbank just beyond where the waves began in no time. They took a brief moment to catch their breath, and that's when the attack came. That second of standing still was all it took for the predator to hone in on a target. It rammed into Elizabeth out of nowhere, grabbing her around the waist. She was propelled forwards like a rocket, but luckily her reaction was instantaneous, and so was Ron's. The beast didn't even get the opportunity to drag her into deeper water, not with the frenzied blows raining down on its head from both its victim and her husband. In the crazed fight against humans and beast, it let Elizabeth go after a particularly hard punch from Ron. It reared back and went for her again, mouth agape and rising out of the water. Elizabeth raised her hands in defense, just as Ron slammed it on the side of the head. Its mouth snapped shut, right around Elizabeth's wrist, and it reeled away from the hit, taking her left hand with it. Ron didn't hesitate to pick up his wife and begin to wade her to shore with the help of several swimmers who rushed to them the moment they heard the screams. On the beach, 911 had already been called before they even reached the sand. Elizabeth was losing consciousness fast. The stump where her hand had been was spewing so violently that she was going to bleed out if they didn't do something fast. Ron grabbed the towels that were closest to him, made a tourniquet for the arm, and wrapped her shredded waist and buttock. All those first aid courses he took paid off big time. Elizabeth made it to the hospital in time. There was nothing that could be done for the hand that was deep in the ocean inside the attacker's belly after all. The wounds on her waist were no less serious. So far, she's had 3 surgeries and an extensive amount of muscle damage that can never be repaired. No matter how many hours of physio Elizabeth puts in, chances are that she'll walk with a limp for the rest of her life. Just an hour and a half after the first attack, while Elizabeth was well into her first surgery, the ocean stalker was back at it again. It had traveled 4 miles, and that single hand was just enough to awaken its appetite and make it realize that sandbanks just beyond the waves was a good place for hunting, and it wasn't wrong about that. Unfortunately, the news hadn't spread that far yet, and officials were just beginning to place warning flags and make the necessary calls to all of the lifeguard towers. 15-year-old twins Lulu and Ellie Gribben were out at a sandbank with their friend 17-year-old McCrae Frost. Like the Foleys, they were standing in waist-deep water, looking for sand dollars. There were a few other people on that bank too, so Lulu probably wasn't targeted specifically. She just happened to be the closest person to where the shark came rocketing out from the ocean. And again, the events played out almost identically to Elizabeth's. Lulu was grabbed by her right leg, and her sister and friend sprang into action, punching, kicking, and fighting the thing before it could slip back into the deep. The water instantly turned red, making it impossible to see where they were hitting. McCrae kicked her foot out wildly, connecting with the razor teeth that were still clamped around Lulu's leg. She didn't even feel the dozens of shards slice through her foot. She just kept going. Lulu, half under the water now and struggling for air, began to try to force the impossibly large jaws open, trying to pry them from her leg. In the madness and the pain, Lulu didn't even feel her hand being sawed through. Whether it was Ellie, McCrae, or another man that jumped into the fight, who struck the animal hard enough to drive it off, no one knows. One moment it had Lulu underwater and on its way to dragging her into the deep, and the next, it fled from the onslaught of more and more people jumping in to fight it off so fiercely. The man who jumped in to help scooped Lulu up in his arms and set out for the beach. Ellie and another stranger helped McCrae, whose foot had finally given out on her. On the beach, a crowd was already waiting for them, and there just happened to be 2 doctors and a nurse among them. Like a well-oiled machine, as if they'd worked together for years, the 3 had Lulu's leg and hand secured with towels and t-shirts. McCrae's foot was wrapped up too, and they managed to patch them up so well that when Lulu's mother arrived at the scene, her daughter was still conscious, and the wounds were no longer streaming out. If it weren't for those 3, Lulu would have bled to death long before the ambulance arrived. One of the doctors got into the ambulance with her. Still in his swimming trunks, he began to converse over the radio with the surgeons waiting at the emergency bay. He took off his trunks, threw on the surgical gown and boots, and assisted in the multiple surgeries that were taking place on Lulu at the same time. Just like Elizabeth, Lulu's left hand was completely gone. It was just a matter of sealing the stump and blunting the sharp ends of bone. For hours, the surgeons worked to save her right leg, but in the end they had to admit to themselves that there was just nothing they could do. The leg was amputated, and Lulu became a double amputee overnight. That evening, when the beach doctor finally walked out of the operating room, he found the other doctor and nurse from the beach still at the hospital, waiting for an update. It seems that a close friendship is already developing between the 3 people who'd been strangers to each other just hours before. Getting the paperwork sorted out with a surgeon who wasn't registered at that hospital was a bit of a headache, but since the family had no intention of contesting it at all, the details were sorted out eventually. McCrae's foot was almost overlooked in the chaos. By the time she got to the hospital on the second ambulance, they feared that her foot would be the 4th limb to be removed that day. But luckily, only 2 small bones were broken, and she needed more stitches than anyone thought a foot could hold. She's expected to make a full recovery. In the days that followed, the support flowing in from across Florida and the whole of the U.S. was almost a little overwhelming. Crowds holding vigils already gathered before Lulu was out of surgery, and they continued until her release. Churches in Florida were suddenly overflowing, and several institutions reported that they didn't have enough seats to accommodate everyone. The state felt like they needed to pray, both for the 3 victims and for the now missing attacker that was still out there somewhere. Because despite clearing the seas for 3 days and keeping lookouts stationed every mile along the shoreline, there's been no sighting of a fin or tail. Given the ferocity and sudden nature of the attacks, no one's been able to confirm the species or the size of it. The speculation, judging by the bite wounds, is that it's a bull shark, but that's all that anyone has to go on for now. Funds were raised, and in less than a week all 3 women's hospital bills were paid for, and Lulu even had enough funds to fit her with prosthetics for both her hand and leg. McCrae is already back on her feet, albeit with crutches for the time being. But Elizabeth's husband only made one statement through their church, letting everyone know that she's recovering well, that she needs time with her family, and to prepare for the long road of physiotherapy that's lying ahead of her. One thing is certain, though. Only time will tell if the shark, that learned in just 90 minutes that humans can be prey, will decide to come back to the sandbanks where kids so often hunt for sand dollars, shells, and crabs. And if that Friday afternoon is anything to go by, the next person to get attacked might not be lucky enough to avoid their final affliction. When Andrew Oberle sat in class as an 8-year-old boy, his 2nd grade teacher taught him and his fellow pupils about Jane Goodall and her amazing research and life with chimpanzees in Africa. He rushed home, inspired by the story, and told his mother then and there that when he grew up, he wanted to work with chimps. There was something about them that fascinated him. He spent as much time as he could at zoos as a child, and then as an adult. He would sit in front of the chimp enclosures and observe their behavior. He would watch them on TV documentaries, demonstrating their tool use, their cleverness, and human-like qualities. His chance at fulfilling a lifetime's ambition came when he was studying for his master's degree in anthropology and primatology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He arranged to research chimp behavior at South Africa's Chimp Eden for his dissertation project. The sanctuary was founded by Eugene Cussons in collaboration with the Jane Goodall Institute in 2006 to house rescued chimps from Central Africa. Many of the great apes have been victims of the bushmeat trade, having watched their parents butchered by poachers and left to fend for themselves. Others were used as entertainment and forced to perform tricks or subjected to unspeakable cruelty and left in solitary cages all their lives until they were rescued. When Andrew arrived at the sanctuary, he was in heaven. It was exactly the kind of work he had waited his entire life for, and he was eager to get stuck into his research. But tragedy was waiting for him just around the corner. After less than a month working at Chimp Eden, he was giving a tour to some visitors when disaster struck. He paused outside the all-adult enclosure to speak about the individuals they had there and their past history when he spotted a large stone just on the other side of the low-lying electric fence. He casually stepped over the wire and removed the stone. It was something that the chimps could easily have picked up and hurled at unsuspecting visitors. But as Andrew went to step back over the electric wire, he suddenly felt a sharp tug on his legs. The adult males were enraged by the intruder. Although Andrew had meant no harm, he was still in their territory without their permission. They dragged him across the dry ground for more than 30 feet and began pummeling him with their fists. The blows rained down on the young student as he tried to protect himself. A keeper, who saw the attack unfolding, honked the horn of his vehicle and leant out the window and fired a warning shot from his gun. But the crack from the firing gun did nothing to deter the chimps. They savaged Andrew, their sharp teeth cutting into his flesh, ripping at his skin and muscle, tearing it. Even with adrenaline pumping through his body, the pain was indescribable. At first, Andrew begged with the chimps to stop. He knew them individually. That's what added to the pain of the trauma, the fact that he had worked with these animals and to some degree believed that he had gained some kind of trust or mutual understanding with them. Nikki, "Amadeus, stop it! Please don't!" he cried. But it didn't work. They continued their brutal attack. Amadeus lifted Andrew's hand up to his mouth and bit his fingers off one by one. It was like a form of cruel torture. Andrew could only watch as the chimp looked him directly in the eyes while it bit off his fingers one at a time. Andrew was horrified. Then he felt the warm, moist breath of Nicky on his face. He stood on Andrew's chest, pinning him down, and brought his hairy face within an inch of Andrew's. He could smell his breath. He could feel wisps of the chimpanzee's facial fur on his cheek. And then, quick as a flash, Nicky the chimp lunged forwards and bit Andrew's nose clean off. As the attack continued, Andrew didn't think it would ever stop. He could feel the damage the chimps were doing, and nothing he tried would stop them. He had tried to talk to them calmly, trying to make them understand that he was no threat. Then he begged them to stop. And finally, he tried to fight back. But with each fully grown male having the strength of 5 men, he didn't stand a chance. Another chimp launched itself at the keeper's vehicle as he tried to stop the attack. It smashed the windscreen and dented the hood, threatening to break into the vehicle and attack him. Instead, he raised his gun and fired through the glass, injuring the chimp, which ran off into the enclosure, closely followed by the others. The chimps had torn Andrew's scalp, peeling the skin back over his skull. They had bitten off both of his ears, half of his right foot, and all the toes from his left foot. The powerful blows that came crashing down on his torso collapsed his lung, and he was left gasping for air by the time the attack was over. He was rushed to the nearest emergency medical clinic. It was a small doctor's surgery, but the staff there saved his life. They used 25 units of blood just to keep him alive whilst they dressed his wounds. He was then transferred to hospital in Johannesburg, where he underwent emergency surgery. He was placed in an induced coma and given an emergency tracheotomy. His parents, who were in the United States, were called and received the devastating news. Andrew was in terrible shape, and they should try and get over to South Africa as quickly as possible. His mother was told not to get her hopes up. Andrew's chances of survival were slim. He spent 2.5 weeks in the induced coma, whilst doctors worked around the clock to tend to his battered and torn body. When he woke up, he saw his parents smiling down at him. He remembered the attack, but couldn't work out where he was. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Then he tried to move his head, but every inch of his body was sore. When he did manage to look down at his body, all he could see were bloodied bandages from head to toe. He couldn't believe the mess he was in. He couldn't believe the damage that had been done. Then, when the realization of the situation sunk in, he began to feel the physical pain that came from being shredded by the chimpanzees. Most of his backside had been torn off. A goal the doctors set Andrew was for him to sit at the end of his hospital bed for 2 minutes. If he could manage that, then he could fly home and continue his recovery over in the States. His longing for home and to see his faithful dog again drove him to keep going. But sitting up was more difficult than he ever imagined. The pain was incredible. Even when the doctors conducted bandage changes, he was pumped full of painkillers. His mother would place a towel over his head and some headphones over his ears so that he could try and escape the pain of it all. But gradually, day by day, he managed to move a little bit more, until one day, 5 weeks after waking from his coma, Andrew finally managed to sit up for the full 2 minutes. He was on the plane to America in a matter of days, where he met some incredible doctors and plastic surgeons to try and fix his broken face and body. At the St. Louis University Hospital, Chief of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, Dr. Bruce Kramer, took skin and muscle from Andrew's belly to fix his wrist. He then rearranged the tendons in his wrist, enabling Andrew to move it once again, and even get the use of his thumb back, which he lost during the attack but was sewn back on. Using the skin from Andrew's forehead and the cartilage from his ribs, Dr. Michael Bernstein reconstructed Andrew's nose. It took time for Andrew to come to terms with the attack that left him scarred for life. It changed him in so many ways, but due to the strong support network around him from family and friends to doctors, surgeons, and mental health specialists, he was able to recover. he found a new determination to finish his master's thesis. It wasn't going to be the same one he started out in South Africa. He wasn't able to work with chimps again, but this one he completed behind his computer in the comfort of his mother's home. He was eventually awarded his master's and walked out on the stage on his new prosthetics to collect his certificate on Mother's Day, with his mother watching proudly on. Since then, Andrew has helped to set up the Oberle Institute, a trauma program that helps patients thrive in recovery and get back out into the world after devastating and life-changing events. But no matter the amount of trauma recovery programs Andrew has taken, he can never escape the terrifying memories of the day he had his face ripped apart by two chimpanzees, narrowly escaping his horrifying final affliction.